To a certain extent, this is a redundant piece. I think it's self-evident at this point that singling out FromSoft games as uniquely difficult is just an exercise in wankery. Like the vast and expansive headcanon that's generated to justify the claim that the obtuse and vague storytelling of Dark Souls and Elden Ring is actually brilliant 500 IQ stuff, it's a post hoc elevation, an attempt to make the games seem as amazing as the emotional attachment fans feel towards them would seem to justify. Not unlike the posthumous elevation of Jesus from prophet to literally God by his most ardent sycophants. That is not to say they are easy, only that they're not special. Other difficult games exist, much as some may pretend they don't, or downplay how difficult they are. Granted, difficulty is a two-way street. Both the game and the player contribute to it. If a game is easy, but the player is a total novice, or a total moron, they will find the game difficult anyway. Likewise, an experienced or skilled player may find difficult games easy, since they are already familiar with how to meet its challenge. This very phenomenon seems to have had some deleterious effects on Elden Ring, actually. In order to keep the game difficult for Souls veterans, thus avoiding the preemptively levied criticism that the game was going to be dumbed down for a mass audience, some enemies in this game have, arguably, been overtuned. Malenia, the Revenants, the Rune Bears, and the fucking Lobsters come to mind. We're reaching the point where only making things outright unfair will maintain the difficulty for the hardcore FromSoft junkies, and I hope it doesn't go that far, because as any fan of multiplayer games knows, balancing games around the preferences of the most dedicated hardcore players usually ruins the game for everyone else. But it's not just within a given genre, gameplay-wise specifically. This rings true. Comparing genres drives my point even more decisively. Consider the sort of challenge Elden Ring provides. Yes, it has generally low tolerance for error. That's what makes it difficult, but that's a given. Mechanically, what you're actually doing is solving a puzzle, the puzzle of the opponent's moveset. Depending on how exactly you fight an opponent, you may have to learn more or less of its moveset to actually defeat it. Complete mastery is only needed really for challenge runs, but that is nevertheless your main task when faced with an enemy. Observe what canned moves they can perform, and through trial and error or intuition, though intuition is often wrong, thus degenerating into guesswork anyway, learn how to counter their moves with your own in order to defeat them. Becoming good at Elden Ring ultimately involves memorizing the movesets of each enemy and how to dodge them, along with timings for rolls and parries, triggers for certain punishes or attacks, enemy weaknesses, etc. Like a puzzle, once you've solved it, not just in knowing what to do, but how to do it, since it's a real-time action game, the challenge is neutralized. And this becomes even more true if you've played the Dark Souls games, since many enemies from those games have been essentially copy-pasted into Elden Ring to greater or lesser extents, meaning you come into the game already knowing how to defeat many of its threats. Needless to say, however, this is not the only kind of challenge a game can provide. No matter how difficult one may find solving the puzzle of a Souls boss, defeating it does not necessarily impart skills transferable to other games with other sorts of challenge, and therefore does not make you, generally speaking, some kind of elite gamer. Being good at FromSoft games doesn't imply you're a god at any other kind of game. From's bosses are what I'd call a ring or two up from a classic boss, which is one whose moves are completely preset and pattern-based. Most of their attacks are canned animations that can't be modified on the fly, i.e. they aren't adaptable, and they often cycle through their arsenal of moves, though there is sometimes leeway given for them to change their attack patterns, though not what the attacks themselves consist of. Some do have adaptive behaviors, however, especially as counters to particular actions taken by the player, such as attempting to heal, or performing a ranged attack, or panic rolling, or some such. Their design leans far more towards the pattern learning side, as in traditional bosses, but they do have some ability to react to what the player is doing, some bosses more than others. You can contrast this with a fully adaptable enemy, whose every move is adaptive to what the player is doing. Say, for instance, an elite from Halo. It sees you in the open. It shoots at you while running around to throw your aim off. You hit it back. It dodges to throw your aim off further. It depletes your shields. You duck behind cover. It throws a grenade at you. You deplete its shields. It backs off behind cover to recharge them, etc. It doesn't have a canned move set that ignores the current context, i.e., if you just stand there shooting at it, it isn't going to cycle through different attacks like shooting at you, then tossing a grenade, then charging you with an energy sword, then going back to shooting, etc., like a FromSoft boss would. It's just going to shoot you dead. It's not going to stop doing a particular thing, like shooting at you, because it's been doing it too long and is now obliged to switch to a different attack in order to create identifiable attack patterns and thus punish windows. It's going to choose an action that suits the current situation because it's actively trying to kill you. There's patterns to how it acts: take cover, get naded, break shields, runs away, etc. But they're entirely context dependent, not fixed. You can change the AI's behavior by changing the context. These kinds of enemies are often found in action games, though the degree to which their adaptability matters depends on their behavior repertoire and how powerful the player is. I used Halo as an example because the player is not per se a powerhouse that can effortlessly mow down elites by the dozen in a single firefight, and the elites also have a bunch of actions they can actually take in response to the player. A lot of shooters, however, seem to compensate for making the enemy AI crafty by making the player extremely powerful. See, say, Crysis or New Wolfenstein or Fear. There's also a lot of games where the enemies just have few tools in their belt other than shoot gun, take cover, and sometimes throw grenade, and that's it, making adaptability kind of moot because they have little to adapt to the situation with. As such, learning to deal with adaptable enemies is often not actually necessary in a lot of games. Where it is, it can be best described as on-the-fly pattern recognition rather than memorization. You will learn to identify what behaviors the enemies have and what triggers them, allowing you to, in turn, identify how to counter each. Elite dodging around, improve your aim, improve your target tracking so it doesn't keep throwing your aim off. Need to retreat to cover? Make sure you're out of grenade throwing range or you have somewhere you can fall back to safely if you get naded. Elite hiding to regen its shields? Frag it yourself or close in to finish it off. Player acts, AI reacts, player reacts to them, etc. A dance of sorts. If we go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, from a classic pattern-based boss, we'd find enemies with completely randomized behavior. Now, off the top of my head, I can't think of any completely randomized enemies because it's hard to design combat properly if the enemy itself has no design beyond what moves it's allowed to perform. How is one even supposed to learn to combat something that has no predictable behavior? Your success or failure becomes random at that point, and therefore the game itself stops being a challenge and turns into a dice roll, a slot machine. And people who desire that sort of enthrallment to RNG tend towards gambling of some variety, either traditional or electronic or gacha, rather than traditional games. That is not to say randomness cannot be utilized to create a skillfully surmountable challenge, only that it cannot be the only element present. RPGs, after all, have always used RNG to partially randomize outcomes, but it has never been the sole element present. It exists to create excitement from unexpected outcomes and to encourage thought on the player's part regarding how to deal with the dice rolls. Hedge and compensate, or bet on them. Try to minimize them, or make them part of your strategy. Critical hit chance, anyone? Therein we find an example of randomness actually encouraging development of game skill, namely, how to build one's character to deal with its presence, whatever form that takes. Were I to identify an AI opponent that is the complete opposite of a FromSoft boss in terms of design, it would not be one that is entirely random, since many FromSoft bosses are not entirely fixed in their actions, and fixed patterns are the opposite of total randomness, nor would it be one that is easy and trivial to defeat. After all, there are bosses in Elden Ring that are exactly that, a penny for the poor cemetery shade, if you would. Rather, it would be one that requires a totally different skill set, or at least as far as is practical. Without being totally random, some degree of pattern recognition is always going to exist, for instance. And I can think of no better exemplar than the alien from Alien Isolation, a partially random, otherwise adaptive opponent, in contrast with the partially adaptive, otherwise pattern design of a FromSoft boss. The alien's randomized element is its pathing. The section of the level it chooses to search at any given time is adaptable to the player's location, the player's actions, to what extent it has detected the player, and where the AI director is telling it to go, but within that area, assuming it gathers no further hints as to the player's location, its search pattern is randomized. It's utterly impossible to predict where it's going to go and when. As such, it isn't possible to, as with most enemies in most stealth games, observe and avoid the alien's patrol path perfectly without being seen, as its path is not fixed and constantly changes, making any attempt to memorize it pointless. You are forced into learning on-the-fly avoidance tactics rather than methodically calculated ones, a dramatic change from basically every other stealth game. On top of this, as said, the alien is otherwise highly adaptable to the player's actions, and since it can't be killed, you cannot, as in most action games, simply headshot it a few times to kill it, neutralize its threat, and bypass its behavior tree. You have to dance the play and counterplay dance an adaptive AI opponent demands. This synergizes with the randomized pathing very well. After all, the smaller the search area, the more dangerous random pathing is, since any momentary opportunity to move or escape on the player's part is tiny. The larger the alien's search area, the more likely it is for you to find a longer break in line of sight. The further it can potentially get from you, thus increasing the time it takes to chase you down if you are detected, and the less likely it is for it to do a 180 2 seconds after passing you and catch you in transit. As such, the player must try to minimize the number of hints they give the alien as to their location. Stay out of sight and do not make noise, or you will draw its search noose closer around you. As in an RPG, the randomized element exists to facilitate a different sort of skill expression, though in this case it's not character building, but evasion. The alien actually takes adaptive behavior to a second level by being able to mimic learning by having new behaviors made available to it due to exposure to various actions by the player. Anyone who has played the game has probably noticed that as you throw flares and noisemakers, which are essentially a finite supply of free movement that temporarily eliminates the threat of the randomized pathing by fixing the alien in place, the alien becomes less and less interested in them and is distracted for less and less time. You probably also notice that the first time you hit the alien with the flamethrower, effectively a reset button that forces the alien back into the vents to restart its search effort, it immediately fled. But by the end of the game, it would merely hiss at a lick of flame and required a few seconds of sustained torching to drive off, thus burning through your fuel supply ever more rapidly. So it is not merely that the player must adapt to what the alien is doing. The alien also adapts over time to what the player does, decreasing the effectiveness of the tools designed to give them breathing room and of tactics they have until then been relying on, requiring both adaptability and greater skill on the player's part to adapt along with the opponent. Other than when and where the alien first spawns into any section it is intended to appear in, it has no prescripted behavior. All its actions are either randomly generated or done in response to the player or the AI director. Your frame-perfect roll window memorization skills in a From game won't help you at all here. There's not really anything to memorize, because there's not really anything guaranteed. Expected behaviors, sure, whack wall, alien comes running, etc., but it's all, at best, contextual. At worst, it's random. There is no predictable sequence of actions, no fixed move set to memorize, no guaranteed punish windows. The alien is trying, at every moment, It's best to find and kill you with whatever branch on its behavior tree will best enable it to do so, and you have to work around it second by second, always with the uncertainty of where it might go next, always having to think of contingency plans, escape routes, and possible hiding spots should it head your way at any given moment. A skilled gamer would, I hope, be able to learn to beat both games reliably, since that would cultivate a wider range of skills than merely beating yet another Miyazaki game. I'm not going to pretend this is some kind of profound revelation. It should be obvious by this point, as I said at the beginning. I merely wanted to reiterate this old argument with a vividly contrasting example, as I hope that makes the absurdity of the pedestal some put FromSoft's games upon, especially in terms of difficulty, plain and obvious. I'm not even saying From fans need to like a completely different kind of challenge as one would find in Alien Isolation. That doesn't matter to me. It is sufficient merely to admit that challenge is multifaceted and dependent on the skills the game aims to test, combined with a low margin of error, rather than being synonymous with one man's creative output. That is all.